Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video on Realizations. In today's video, I'll try to share everything that I know about CAT reading comprehensions, from tips and tricks to read better to how to eliminate options. So the thing is that most students think that in CAT reading comprehensions, your goal is to identify the right answer. That's not the case, and that is what makes CAT reading comprehensions so different from the reading comprehensions we did in school, because here the goal is to identify the 3 wrong options. Yes, the moment I understood this, my accuracy in reading comprehensions increased drastically, and I'll be sharing with you how I did that step by step. In my opinion, the main goal of the CAT VARC question setter is to filter out those candidates who have either not understood the passage correctly or have not understood the question correctly, because they try their best to add in all very consciously created options that may seem to be almost right but are not. And therefore, your goal then becomes to make sure that you don't fall for such made up traps. So in this video, I'll be covering how toppers read RCs. Yes, I'll be walking you through the best practices to read RCs. And then we cover some very important tips and tricks on how to eliminate options, which is, again, like I said, the most important part of reading comprehensions. And at each point, I'll give you ample number of examples so that it becomes very, very clear for you. So before we get to the reading tips and the elimination tips, let me explain to you why is it that most students struggle with RC. I've seen 3 main problems with students when they are reading RCs. First is that they get very panicky or they get very anxious when they see very long abstract passages. Second, as they are reading, they try to memorize everything. Okay, what did I read in paragraph 1? These were the names, these were the dates. And if you're trying to remember so many things while you are reading, chances are that you will lose concentration. And third, most non-serious students, they read the passage very leisurely without getting into the analytical zone or without trying to understand what the author is trying to say, more like a novel. And all these 3 reasons only add to your problems, because one, there's already so much time pressure, you cannot add more pressure on your head when you see passages. Second, CAT never tests memory, so memorizing or keeping everything in your head while you're reading does not help either. And finally, you cannot just get away with reading the passage like a novel, because there is so much analytical detail that you'll have to unpack when you're answering the questions. So let's first talk about how to read RCs. Of course, all of us know how to read in the general sense, but given the time pressure, given the fact that there are so many inbuilt mines that you could step on if you don't read in great detail or you've not understood the passage completely, it becomes very important that you know the tips and tricks to read fast, to read more effectively. Of course, the biggest thing that you can do is to increase the volume, practice reading a lot. But apart from that, here are some things that you can do to directly focus more on the way you should read comprehensions. And the first is skimming effectively. You don't have to read every word in the passage with the same attention. In the first reading, your brain should focus mainly on getting the overall message of the passage. What are the main nouns? What are the main adjectives? What's the tone of the author? Teach your brain to skip the parts like the, of, from. And while you're skimming, also make a mental note of what each paragraph is talking about. And this brings us to the second point, which is to title or summarize each paragraph in 3 to 5 words. Yes, after you've read one paragraph, just either make a mental note or wrote it down just above the passage that, okay, this passage was about this, maybe the importance of something, or maybe the limitations of something, or here the author is comparing something. So just 3 to 5 word summaries, that's it, just title. And how this helps is that now your brain does not need to remember the 700 words. You just have 4 to 5 headers that you have to take care of. The next point is scrap the facts. You don't need to memorize all the facts or even the names or the dates. If there is a specific question regarding a fact, you can always come back up. So if the passage says Leonardo da Vinci proposed this, your mind should read it like in so and so proposed something. You only need location memory as to where that part is, not photographic memory. This will become even more clear when in another video I will show you and read along with you, so as to show you how skimming actually works when you're reading really fast. Next comes the most important part of the video, which is the tips and tricks that you can use to eliminate options. And the goal is that using these techniques that I'm just about to share, you will be able to eliminate 1 or 2 or sometimes even 3 options. It may happen that sometimes you're not able to eliminate any option using these, and that's okay. Even if you're not able to eliminate any options, these tips and tricks could come very handy and are very helpful even in the general reading sense. And to explain each of these methods, I've taken one line from a passage of CAT 2024 slot 1 VARC, and I'll show you how that same passage or that same line can be distorted to create wrong options. So the line is, the contrast between artisanship and efficiency first came to the fore in the 19th century when British manufacturers suddenly faced competition from across the Atlantic as firms developed the American system using standardized parts. The worldwide success of the Singer sewing machine showed the potential of a mass-produced device. Okay, so the first method how you can eliminate an option is using the technique of hasty generalization. Here what happens is that the trait of one particular person or one particular item in the passage is taken and applied to the whole group. Example, if the text says that some students create content, the option could be that all students create content, which is a trap because there is a generalization. And let's see how this will play out in the example that we are taking. So the hasty generalization of this line could be, the success of the Singer sewing machine proved that all mass-produced products are superior to handcrafted goods. So now, why is this option wrong? That's because it takes one example of the Singer sewing machine and then it generalizes it universally to all mass-produced products. The next method is distortion or attractive word trap. Here the option will have words very similar from what is in the passage, but there is a very slight tweak which completely changes the inference or the meaning of the sentence. But here you have to be conscious that you don't get fooled by similar words and focus more on the meaning. Example, British manufacturers developed the American system to compete with firms across the Atlantic. In this option, the keywords remain the same, but it's completely reversed that who developed the system. It were the Americans, but here it says the British manufacturers. The next method is extremism, and extremism is not just important in RCs, but it's also very useful in verbal ability questions where you have to maybe summarize a passage. Because here what is done is that there are words like all, never, forever, highest, even though when the author says something like may happen or is good. So it's a superlative that is used. The example could be, the rise of standardized parts completely destroyed the artisanship in the 19th century. So why this option is wrong is that the author never said completely destroyed. That's far too strong for that line. The next method is verbatim trap, and it's very interesting because what happens is a line is taken from the passage like exactly word to word, not a single word has been changed, and students think that it's exactly from the passage, how this is definitely the right answer, but they miss the fact that that line, that option has to answer the question being asked, which is the case here. So that line exactly taken word to word, yeah, it's there in the passage, but you have to see, does that line answer the question? Now let's see the example that this was the line you were given. The worldwide success of the Singer sewing machine showed the potential of a mass-produced device. Again, it's exactly taken from the passage, but if the question was that what is the main argument of the author, then this line does not make sense because agreed that it has been taken exactly from the line, but it does not answer the full question. It's just like hinting at a small part of the answer. So the next method is very narrow or very broad options. So a narrow option only summarizes one specific paragraph of the whole passage and misses all the other important details. Whereas the broad option claims far beyond the scope. So it will take some idea which is being discussed in the passage and then generalize it, or in the broad option, it will take one claim from the passage, but then maybe go on to link it to something very broad. Let me show you by example. So a narrow faulty option could be, the passage mainly talks about the Singer sewing machine, which is not the case because the Singer sewing machine is just one example instead of the main debate, which is artisanship versus efficiency. So this is a narrow option and hence wrong. An example of a broad option could be, the passage argues that industrialization permanently transformed every aspect of the global society. Now, why is this wrong? Because it goes far beyond what is discussed in the passage. We haven't reached the topics of industrialization or the society at large in the passage. The next elimination method is out of scope. What happens here is that there'll be one idea in the passage and maybe you know some things about it, But the options will go on to say something which is related, but something that is nowhere mentioned in the passage. So if the passage is about marriage, that faulty option could go on to touch topics like marriage laws or alimony. And therefore, that's out of scope. For example, the American system eventually led to modern globalization and multinational corporations. Now, this may sound true. Yeah, it could have happened that those systems led to globalization and MNCs, but nowhere in the passage are these topics discussed. The next elimination method is faulty comparison. So here, the option goes on to compare two things which may be in the passage, but they have never been compared. For example, the passage suggests that British manufacturers were less innovative than American firms. Now, yeah, both these topics were covered, but the author never compared the innovativeness of the British and the American firms. The next method is wordplay, and you can miss this if you're not very careful. So there is just a slight change in one word which completely changes the meaning. For example, the word compliment, that means praising someone. But then there's the other word compliment, just a change of one alphabet, and that completely changes to like something that enhances something else. That's the meaning of compliment. Example, the Singer sewing machine exposed the limitations of mass-produced devices. Now the wordplay is the word limitations. The author meant potential, but here the slight single wordplay is potential. The author was talking about the potential of mass-produced devices, not limitations. The next method is external knowledge, and this is also slightly similar to out of scope. But this could be far more basic. No matter how educated you are or how well you know about a topic, even if, let's say, you're a researcher, but if, let's say, the passage says that the moon is made of cheese, you do not have to use your brain and think that, no, this is wrong, the moon is made of rocks or something like this. You have to ignore real world facts and only stick to what is mentioned in the passage. For example, Singer's success proved that mass production always produced better quality products than artisanal manufacturing. Now, in real life, this could be true. But since there's no information about improvements in affordability, scalability, consistency, or the quality, so this option feels like believable, but it's external knowledge and therefore wrong. The next method is wrong cause and effect. So let's say in the passage, the author says that A leads to B, and in the faulty option, you will have something like B leads to A. So the cause and effect has been swapped. Example, British manufacturers adopted standardized parts because Singer sewing machine became globally successful. So this is completely opposite of what was there in the passage. The adoption happened first and then the success happened, not the other way around. The next elimination method is better word choice. Here, there may be two options which both are right, but you have to pick the one which is more precise or more suited to what the author is exactly trying to say. Example, there are two sentences. Mass production influenced manufacturing trends in the 19th century. Correct, basis the line. The second is, the emergence of standardized manufacturing methods highlighted the growing tension between efficiency and traditional craftsmanship. So this is more nuanced and more deeply aligned to what the author is trying to say. Therefore, option like the first is weak and the second is more nuanced and hence the correct one of the two. The next elimination method is to check the tone or the attitude of the author and matching it with the option. While reading, you always have to make up your mind whether the tone of the author is critical or sarcastic or appreciative, and remember that when you're selecting options. So, example, the passage celebrates the triumph of American capitalism over outdated British manufacturing. The moment you read this, it should click in your head, no, the author never celebrated anything. He was never very positive about anything. He was just analytical and historical about how things happened. So that's wrong. The next elimination method is check both sides or half right, half wrong. Here what happens is that the first part of the sentence could be right and maybe again verbatim, but the next part of the sentence is wrong. Like if you read the whole sentence, the meaning is different from what is being talked about in the passage. For example, the passage discusses the rise of standardized manufacturing in the 19th century, but argues that mass-produced devices ultimately failed commercially. So yeah, the first part till the 19th century was in line with the passage, but the next part is completely opposite because the Singer sewing machine was a success. And the last method is quantity versus quality. Here, the wrong option could confuse a numerical issue, something like not enough space, to a qualitative issue, something like not good space. Passage was talking about quantity, but the options are talking about quality. Example, the passage argues that artisanship declined because factories produced too many goods. Again, this is wrong. Why? Because the author nowhere talked about quantity, nowhere talked about numerical excess. He was talking about qualitative things, quality. A huge shout out to Shabana ma'am, because all these methods were inspired by her video, and since I found them really helpful, I thought of sharing it with my wider audience. Okay, now let me share a few more things with you about option eliminations. There are two things that I want to say here. One, if two options seem very, very similar and both are correct, then you have to go with the one which is more nuanced. Select the option which does not use over inference, as in it does not complement or adds more information to what the author already added. That is, you don't have to use a lot of your own brain or own facts here. So if, let's say, remote work improved productivity in several firms, that's the line in the passage. You cannot infer in any way that remote work is better for all companies, or that offices are unnecessary, or hybrid work is the future. None of the things, like, in your mind, logically, these could be conclusions. But since none of these are in the passage, it cannot be inferred. So don't choose the option where there is any information where you have to add any additional context to understand it. Because CAT usually rewards options which are least supported by assumptions and only supported by the author's exact claims. And finally, if none of this works and you are stuck between options, then compare the two options word by word, phrase by phrase, against each other and then against the passage. Because sometimes just one change in word with just some logical step or some interjector, the meaning would be changing, and that's what you have to identify. Okay, now we are done with all the reading techniques and tips and tricks. Now let's move on to what I would do daily for a lot of practice. Twice a week, I would read 2 to 3 passages in an untimed way, where I'm trying to teach myself how to consciously eliminate options using the techniques I learned. And then 2 to 3 passages in a timed manner to see that am I able to incorporate this or not when I'm in pressure. Next, read one editorial or one passage every day, and then slowly move on to sectional mocks. Because in VRC, there's not much learning that you have to do after you've understood all the different types of questions. And please keep a mistake notebook. Whenever you give a mock and you got some questions wrong, note down why you got the questions wrong. Remember, RC is not a reading test or an English grammar test or a vocabulary test. It's a thinking test which only comes where you can train yourself with practice and teach yourself pattern recognition. Because remember, the students who score the highest in VRC are not the ones with the most amazing English or with the most amazing vocabulary, or they are not the fastest readers. They are very calm decision makers using all the logic that they know. So I hope this video was able to teach you that in RCs, you don't have to go and see which the correct answer. You have to evaluate which are the options that are wrong and then reach to the option that remains. If you took away that one single point from this video, then my mission is accomplished, and I hope you incorporate that. I hope you found this video helpful. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, add in your questions in the comments that you would want me to answer, and see you in the next video where I'll be breaking down the verbal ability section of CAT and give you tips and tricks for all the different kinds of verbal ability questions. Till then, bye bye, all the best.